As we've been reporting all this week, the Pimicikamak Cree Nation in Manitoba declared a state of emergency after a recent 4-day power outage left water and plumbing systems with severe damage and thousands of residents evacuated. For more on this, our weekly Truth in Politics panel is back for a new year of critical analysis on the stories behind the headlines. Jennifer Laewetz is the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Niigaan and Jennifer, thank you both for joining us. We'll start with you, Niigaan. Pimicikamak Cree Nation and 4 other Northern First Nations signed the Northern Flood Agreement with Manitoba Hydro in 1977. Fast forward 48 years and here we are, a single power line leading into the community breaks, leaving the whole community and thousands of people freezing in the dark. Their water lines freezing, pipes are bursting. What do you make of the situation?
Not only is it indicative of the ongoing neglect and the ongoing use of First Nations for predominantly extraction purposes, taking things from them, and then leaving them in a mess, in a situation that's of great harm. And we saw in Manitoba, like we see in many First Nations, chronically over years, which is when emergencies happen, you get massive problems, not just for the people who are there, but then also for everyone else. And those huge problems are based in evacuations. They're now health crises, mental health crises. Many communities are in situations in which they experience these traumas every few months. And so that puts tremendous stresses on everybody. And this is the ongoing mistreatment that we often talk about in this panel about for First Nations, but it really is indicative of taking things from First Nations and then never giving anything back other than just the very minimal things.
And Jennifer, Pimicikamak was among several that had to be evacuated last summer due to the worst wildfire season on record here in Manitoba. Now here they are over Christmas being evacuated again. What does this say about living conditions up north?
Well, I think I've said this on this panel before, that this is a really clear indication that a lot of our people, especially our people in the north, are living in a constant state of crisis, and it does not end. And what's concerning about this is the fact that there are youth and there are kids that are impacted by this. So that's where we need to stop pretending that our Indigenous youth, especially our Indigenous Northern youth, are getting the same type of living conditions or the same type of life that kids in urban centers would get, because they're not. They're disrupted from their homes, they're disrupted from their school life, their families are displaced. And this is now, a national emergency. And I just wish all levels of government would stop responding to emergencies in a way that they don't first prevent them. Better infrastructure, better crisis planning, all of these different things could help aid in these situations. But we're begging for them to address these crises, but the prevention really needs to be there. And we need, in my opinion, a national framework that comes into place and is actually utilized in instances exactly like this.
Niigaan, this doesn't happen in other places. Why do you think this keeps happening in our communities?
Well, a pretty simple answer to that is that our communities aren't treated like human beings. And this would never be tolerated by people who are seen as valuable contributing members of society. Many of our First Nations are afterthoughts of governments, and the indications of that is oftentimes what you'll hear is situations on First Nations, chronic situations, like for instance, boil water situations, but in this case, just basic infrastructure that supports people in freezing temperatures to keep heat on in their houses. This is then put into the realm of reconciliation. This is not reconciliation. This is treating people like human beings. And so we need to see First Nations like how we see other people in this country. We oftentimes see that in cities, for example, you would never see long-term freezing temperatures where people are in homes having to face life and death situations. It would be fixed immediately, oftentimes within minutes. Oddly enough, Manitoba Hydro's response to the Pimicikamak situation was to fix that situation in 4 days, which, according to my research, is pretty much record time. That's pretty, on one level, good for you, Manitoba Hydro, for getting down to 4 days. But at another level, why the heck does it take 4 days to support people, which then resulted in hundreds and thousands of people being evacuated, tremendous stresses on all of us, and then most importantly, what happens afterwards for the years following?
And Jennifer, do you have any suggestions for the feds or Manitoba Hydro to get some viable solutions happening?
Well, I think if we just address the fact that no community should be living with one power line, that's a really good place to start, but also building, robust systems and backup systems that work. And instead of, again, focusing on emergency management and emergency response, we focus on, a national level of infrastructure management and planning so that this is no longer as big of an issue as it is. Because every time there's an emergency, whether it's wildfires or whatever it is, it really highlights the gap. And it also shows that there's a lack of communication, there's a breakdown in the crisis response. And a lot of the time, our communities don't even know where to turn to. Do we go to the province? Do we go to the feds? It just seems like exactly what Niigaan said, our people are not viewed as valuable enough to even get into that realm of that planning. And I just wholeheartedly don't think that this should even be a thing in 2026.
Absolutely. Okay, Jennifer, first we have the U.S. forces blowing up what they say are Venezuelan drug boats heading to the U.S., followed closely by the arrest of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife less than a week ago. What's the bigger picture here?
Oh, well, I don't even think we know the full picture of this yet, because I think that there's a lot of miscommunication around this issue. And I think that, the media is portraying it in a way of like, the president of the United States just went in and arrested this guy and he's bad news and Venezuelans are now free. And it's like, I think we need to reframe our thinking from this being just criminal in nature to this is geopolitics at play. Resource politics is not a brand new thing. And it actually scares me a little bit because especially as Indigenous people, we are constantly caught in the middle of that. And I think when we start talking about oil, that's where the concern comes in, because then those pressures start building up and then our country is going to need to address it. And again, where Indigenous people get stuck in the middle because the prime minister and his cabinet will start deeming things in the national interest. We need to start ramming these things through. We're in a crisis, all of these things. And Indigenous people will, again, just be caught in the crossfires, especially when it comes to geopolitics. And it's an area that I hope our nations actually start focusing a little bit more on. It's hard to say when we're talking about crisis on community and wildfires and flooding and all of these things. But the things that are going on around the rest of the world, affect our policy here at home, and they affect us and our communities as well.
Niigaan, how does this quest for Venezuelan oil by President Trump affect the Indigenous tribes in that part of South America?
So I'm actually going to go back a little bit in time, and I'm writing a column about this because I've done a bunch of research about Indigenous peoples in Venezuela. Because whenever you hear about resource extraction, it's exactly as Jen said. It's either at the site of where the violence is occurring within statehood, extracting oil, or the forces that are driving that, which are then both impacting Indigenous peoples. Because when you get a war or you get people declaring Canada as a 51st state, then Canada immediately then turns to resource development, which naturally impacts our people. This is all about oil. There's no bones about it, no matter how many times Trump wants to use the term drugs or frame it in such a way that it's interested in terrorism or whatever else he describes it. This is about oil. And Venezuela sits on one of the largest oil deposits, untapped oil deposits in the world. In the 15th century, when the Spanish explorers arrived in what's now known as Venezuela, they met with the Wayo people, the Wario people, the Kalina people. Those are some of the largest groups. There's actually 30 different indigenous tribal groups in Venezuela, what's known today. They noticed that the indigenous peoples had interwoven oil into their culture. They used it for their ceremonies. They used it for fire keeping, and they used it particularly for blessings. Oil was crude oil. It was used regularly as a part of everyday life. And so for many of these indigenous tribes, they are located exactly in the areas of those deposits. Zoom ahead now a few centuries, and of course, we now know that Indigenous peoples have come to a very strong force in the government of Venezuela. Many of them have joined with or worked with government members. There's been recognition of Indigenous rights in Venezuela for a long period of time, but that still hasn't interrupted the massive extraction projects that President Maduro was involved in. And while he actually talked a pretty decent game around Indigenous rights are actually recognized in Venezuela. It didn't stop the extermination of Indigenous leaders, the ostracization of them in society, and the marginalization. And that's only now going to step up because Trump has absolutely no care about what Indigenous rights in Venezuela. Here's what he cares about. He's going to put oil companies in charge He's going to then put resource extraction as the number one, and he's already said the money will all go through me. There's no interest in sharing resource development with Indigenous peoples. And if they get in the way, there will simply be at the targets, with targets on their back, just like what we saw most recently in Minneapolis. And when we know that this government, this U.S. government, when faced with opposition, most often turns to violence, not negotiation.
And Jennifer, you touched on this a bit earlier. How is this all going to affect oil extraction in Alberta, especially in the context of Indian treaty rights?
Well, I think we've seen Alberta kind of taking a different pace than the rest of our country, especially with talks of the separation and just going ahead and Premier Danielle Smith doing what she thinks is right for her province. The problem with that is that global instability is naturally going to cause our country to want to act in a way that the pressure for projects and things like that will ramp up. We already have an issue with consultation and consent. And now that we're seeing, the bills that are passing and the Mark Carney government wanting to go down the path of, deeming projects in the national interest, I think we're going to see over the next 6 to 12 months, especially, that rhetoric really ramp up that Canada needs to do this, Canada needs to respond. And yet again, First Nations are in the back seat because of that. I will say that I am feeling a little good about the fact that there is some changes happening in Alberta. One of the loudest chiefs fighting back against Premier Danielle Smith and her talks about separation and whatever else she's been talking about is Chief Sheldon Sunshine of Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation. And I just saw yesterday that he was announced to be the new Deputy Grand Chief of the Treaty 8 Alberta Chiefs. So it seems like we're getting some stronger leadership in there that have fought the fought and have walked the walk and are going to continue that fight. And that's what we need. And we don't just need the fights at the local level. We need it to be provincial and we need it to be national. And right now, more than ever, the AFN should be doing a lot of their advocacy work against the federal government to ensure that we're getting consultation and consent, especially in times of global uncertainty. But everyone kind of knows that, my faith isn't up here. So I'm going to hope for the best. And that's where I'll leave it.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Niigaan, on the topic of Trump, the Indigenous people of Greenland must be worried about Trump not ruling out using military force as he tries to annex or buy their land. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, of course. Many of those Inuit people who are in Greenland or connected to Greenland or relatives of Inuit people here in Canada would absolutely, I think, our hearts send over to this gross disrespect that is given over the issue of Greenland and its sovereignty. I think what will ward this off, I think this is sort of Trump blowhardedness involving the issue of Greenland. He stepped back in the past 24 hours. He said, we're interested in buying it, not military intervention, because if he did, the second that a U.S. Army battalion landed at Greenland, NATO would be over. And that is a cost that even for Trump, I think is extreme, would be incredulous if he did it. But absolutely is an ongoing process of distraction because of course we know what files need to be released, which we naturally know Trump is involved in, the Epstein files. And we don't know what level, we don't know allegedly what he's been involved in, but it's no coincidence that just at the moment in which his Justice Pam Bondi, a secretary, is facing what likely will be an impeachment process, even by own Republicans, that suddenly there's another global conflict and then ongoing series of global conflicts. There is one, I will use Jen's positive spin for just 1 minute. One thing that may happen out of all of this is that Indigenous peoples do have an opportunity. When governments are coming and they are interested in resource extraction and they're interested in stepping it up, there is an opportunity for First Nations to have leverage and to build perhaps infrastructure, longstanding infrastructure that they've needed. I'm not saying we should all pipeline the heck out of everything. I'm not saying that pipelines or mines or even selling water is a good idea. But I'm saying that, in a positive kind of spin, maybe some long-term infrastructure projects in Alberta might take place, because I actually don't think oil development in Venezuela is going to be very conducive. Crude oil there is almost impossible to get out of the ground. It's even harder than Alberta. And the infrastructure needs will take probably entire term of Trump's presidency and even longer, even past Trump might be dead before they're even able to build pipelines, highway infrastructures in Venezuela, which has been long neglected by the world economy and has never really built much of an oil industry other than those investments from China in the past. And so maybe there might be some positive infrastructure development for those in Alberta who are willing to, as Jen pointed out, start involving themselves in the process.
And lastly, Jennifer, I'm curious if you have any thoughts that you want to share on the Greenland situation and Trump mentioning the military possibly getting involved.
I'm really not surprised. I think that a lot of this is a distraction, especially it seems like whenever he's in hot water for something, he ramps up this crazy rhetoric that kind of gets everybody distracted and, debating things and all of these things. But on the other side of that, I don't want to downplay it because I think that, President Donald Trump is also very serious about some of these things. And I don't think he's kidding. So I think that, national security of all of these different places is very important right now, especially as Canadians. We should not take these threats seriously. And now more than ever, we're going to have to start depending on trade in other areas and, Canadians being really safe when it comes to our relationships and travel to the United States.
I'll just add one thing to what Jen just said. The U.S. already has an agreement to build whatever military base they want on Greenland. They've had it for decades. So this is not about national security at all. This is about Trump trying to get a distraction, also trying to play the big bully on the world stage.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, Niigaan. Well, important discussion, but we will have to leave it there for this week's Truth in Politics panel. Niigaan, Jennifer, thank you both so much.
You gotcha.